There have been hundreds, if not thousands, of books and articles published about the Kennedy assassination by the research community, as we call them. These are just ordinary individuals who have become intrigued by this sort of endless mystery, and they've devoted part of their lives to investigating it. I'm only going to mention one of these because of its significance. In 1980, a book was published by David Lifton called Best Evidence. I believe the subtitle was Disguise and Deception in the Murder of President Kennedy. Lifton did something that no one had ever thought to do before. He visited both of the hospitals that Kennedy saw on November 22nd, 1963. He went to Parkland Hospital in Dallas, where Kennedy was taken immediately after the shooting. There, an attempt was made to save the president's life. And then he went to Bethesda Naval Hospital, just outside of D.C. in Maryland, where the autopsy took place that evening. He interviewed doctors and hospital staff, nurses, and at the two different institutions, and discovered quite a discrepancy in the condition of the president's body and other details. Let me briefly go through Lifton's argument for you. The people at Parkland described the president's wounds, and you can check your images here to see these illustrations. There was a consensus at Parkland among the doctors and nurses that Kennedy had a baseball-sized wound in the back of his head, a blowout wound, indicating a shot from the front. They also said that there was an entrance wound in Kennedy's throat, just about where the necktie is knotted here. The doctors and nurses at Parkland were trying to save the president's life. It became obvious pretty quickly that this was not going to happen. The president was declared dead at 1 o'clock in Parkland. Now, he had no clothing on as he was being operated on, and so when he was declared dead, they simply folded the sheet over him, and they took a towel and wrapped around the president's head because brain and blood were still oozing out of this massive wound in the back of his head. They placed the president's body wrapped in this way into a ceremonial casket. This is simply the type of coffins that you see at a funeral, heavy with wood and brass and side rails for the pallbearers, the typical expensive ornamental casket that most of you are aware of. The president was then loaded onto Air Force One and taken back to Washington. From Andrews Air Force Base, he was taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital. Of course, Kennedy was a naval veteran of World War II. His doctor was at the Naval Hospital, so it was natural that the president's autopsy would take place there. Well, when the president arrived at Bethesda, he was no longer in a large, or rather a heavy ornamental casket. He was in a shipping casket. This is a light metal box that disaster victims would be placed in, or soldiers killed in action in a foreign war. The president was no longer wrapped in a sheet with a towel around his head. He was now in a zipped up body bag. The president's wounds had been altered as well. Instead of a small wound in the back of his head, not a small wound, I would say a wound the size of an orange or a baseball, instead of that size wound in the back of the president's head, now you had most of the top and right side of the president's head missing. The small puncture wound in the president's throat had now been dramatically enlarged. At Bethesda, of course, they turned the body over and checked the back, and a bullet wound was found there as well. It was just a couple of inches to the right of the spine and beneath the shoulder blade. So the wounds, the condition of the body, the wrapping, the casket, all these things were different from one hospital to the other. This, of course, is quite disturbing. The obvious question is, who did this? Who did these changes, and why, and where? Lifton also brought to light a document, an FBI memo, that had been in the record, and no one had noticed these particular sentences in this memo. These two FBI agents were in the autopsy room recording what the doctors said as they went about the procedure. And right there in black and white it says, surgery has obviously been committed to the president's head, namely the top of the skull. So the traditional craniotomy that's done, especially in a gunshot wound to the head, did not have to be done at Bethesda. The top of the head was already removed. The brain itself, the brain stem had been cut, and a good portion of the president's brain was missing. So clearly there had been surgery and a number of other changes between Parkland at 1 o'clock and Bethesda at 7 or 8 o'clock. Now, Lifton was never able to explain how this happened. Speculation is that it might have taken place aboard Air Force One in the flight from Dallas back to Washington. But again, there was no proof of this. So Lifton's argument, as disturbing as it is, sort of remained in the background for the next couple of generations. And we'll come back to it in just a few moments. In early 90s, 91, 92, Oliver Stone released the film JFK, which dealt with the Kennedy assassination. This is sort of a grab bag of a film. It brings in a lot of different theories that have been floating out there for some time regarding the killing of the president. It's well worth watching. The more knowledgeable you are about the case, the better able you'll be to critique the film. But it's well done, and it introduces a lot of the theorists, the research community, the ideas that they've developed over the years about the case and the killing. It also was the first time a new generation of Americans had seen anything about the Kennedy killing, and it aroused a lot of interest. Next thing you know, the Congress, in response to this interest, passed the Freedom of Information Act, which would allow people to request from the government specific documents relating to the Kennedy assassination and other matters. This would in turn lead in the mid-1990s to the establishment of the Assassination Record Review Board, the ARRB. This is the final investigation into the Kennedy case. And it has finally resolved those questions raised by David Lifton in 1980. The alterations to the president's body and the reason that he's in a different casket, in a body bag, et cetera, is that there were two autopsies performed at Bethesda. An early autopsy at 6:30, and then a later autopsy for the general, not the general public, for the viewing audience. And here we're talking about high-level Army, Air Force, naval officials. Two different autopsies. The early autopsy rearranged the wounds, enlarged the throat wound, changed the head wound, did the craniotomy. This was apparently done under the guise of national security. Perhaps the pathologists were told that it was essential that the American people understand that Oswald was the killer, the lone shooter of the president, that he was affiliated with Castro and the communists, and that if this got out, it could result in World War III. So alterations were made to the president's body, and then there was another autopsy at 8 o'clock. And it's very interesting, the chief pathologist, Dr. Humes, even makes the exclamation in front of everyone that surgery has been committed to the president, and he does this in a voice of some surprise. It's speculated now that Humes was simply covering his own actions, that he himself had committed these alterations to the president's body, and he was trying to explain it away in front of the new audience that was watching. So at least one aspect of the Kennedy assassination has to some extent been solved. We know the body alterations. We know where they took place and when. Now, let's see if we can draw some conclusions to this. This topic is poison for the media, for politicians, for historians. No one wants to touch it. The media who reported upon it at the time did not want to stake their prestige on going against the official theory. the Warren Commission's theory of a lone gunman, and have stuck with this theory over the generations. Politicians don't want to touch it because who wants to end up on the wrong side of history? Historians have, for the most part, shied away from it because, again, you don't build an academic career based on speculations on the Kennedy assassination. You risk being included in that dubious group called conspiracy theorist, which would damage your credibility. So the Kennedy assassination has remained a sort of black hole in American history. There are something of a consensus emerging at this late date. One theory holds that Kennedy was killed by elements within the government because he was perceived as being soft on communism. The theory runs kind of like this. Kennedy had a chance to take Castro out at the Bay of Pigs and did not do it. Kennedy had a chance to take Castro out during the missile crisis and did not do it, thereby leaving Cuba in the hands of a communist government and denying American business the wealth that they were used to acquiring in Cuba, as well as the American mob. Kennedy also had delivered the American University speech in the summer of '63. This called for negotiations with the Soviets and perhaps an end to the Cold War. And then in addition to this, the Kennedy administration signed an order bringing home 1,000 American advisors from Vietnam in the fall of 1963. The emerging consensus is that Kennedy was killed for these reasons, that he was viewed as soft on communism, he was not up to the job, he did not understand the Soviet threat, and he was too tolerant of communists close to our shores. Now, the final thing I'm going to say about this concerns Bobby Kennedy, the president's brother and the Attorney General. People have often asked the question, well, Bobby was his brother, why didn't he do something about this? There's a couple of reasons. Number one, I think Bobby Kennedy had a sense of what happened to his brother. I think he had a sense that the assassination teams that had been put together by the CIA and the Mafia to kill Castro, that one of these teams had turned and killed the President of the United States for perhaps betraying the anti-Cubans in Castro. The speculation goes that Bobby Kennedy realized that any investigation of this would reveal he and his brother's involvement in the attempts to assassinate Castro, and would reveal his brother's, how should I put this, insatiable sexual appetite. Kennedy had a woman at every stop, shall we say. And any investigation into the president's death would expose these sort of unseemly things. So Bobby decided to close the book on his brother's death. We can't prove this, but there is a certain logic to it. So I'm going to leave the Kennedy assassination here with you. If you have other questions or you are interested in books or articles to look at, I have a long list of them. Thanks.